I'm just saying this literally was like one of the coolest things I've ever done. And I don't mean like coolest things I've ever done for the show. I mean, this is one of the coolest things I have ever done. And I know that I am at like risking sounding like I am gushing. Again, I'm not saying like the science is cool because it's great. Gushing. I'm gushing. I'm saying that this facility was just dope as hell. It was just really fun to visit and learn, and it was cool.
Welcome back to Cult or Just Weird. Previously on Cult or Just Weird. Who shot JR? Nobody will get that. Nobody's going to get that reference. I just made a reference from the 70s.
Yeah.
I shouldn't even get that. I am so sorry. I'm Chris. I'm a game designer. I'm a data scientist.
And a decrepit
an
old
anachronism.
Man. I'm Kayla. I am a TV writer. I'm a lot of things, honestly.
You'll get the Who Shot JR if you're a TV writer. TV.
I understand Who Shot JR. I am also an elderly woman. I'm also a young woman. I'm a bitch. I'm a lover. I'm a child.
That's also an anachronistic reference, please.
The 90s are back, baby.
Okay, no, but for real, last time on Cult or Just Weird, we discussed the first part of our tour, our trip to Alcor, and we left you in a science lab.
We left you in stasis.
We left you in stasis, much like the frozen patients at Alcor. And who walked into the science lab but co-CEO James Arrowood, and here's what happened next. So maybe first question is like, hold on, like why did he take over the tour from the tour guide? And also, like, why did he spend 2 hours with us?
It's because we're great.
Yes. I mean, obvious reason is that we're awesome and very fun to spend time with. But also, we actually emailed them ahead of time about the fact that we were producing a podcast episode about Alcor. And he was he replied and was very worried about making sure that we portray Alcor correctly.
Which, like after watching the John Wilson episode, I absolutely get.
Yeah, so I would say some of the worry is driven by like typical CEO stuff of wanting to protect the company and its mission, but some of it was also driven by what you just mentioned, like they recently had some media about them and they didn't really care for how they were portrayed. I know you said like some cryonicists thought that the episode was good, but I think by and large, Alcor didn't. There were things, and we might actually get into this in a bonus episode, like what the actual discrepancies were.
Oh, we're gonna do a takedown of John Wilson.
John Wilson. But yeah, so that was part of it, and then part of it was also the fact that Mr. Arrowood is relatively new as Alcor's co-CEO. He was their legal counsel before that, and he's driving a repositioning of Alcor to be less sci-fi, speculative, transhumanist, futurist, and more about moving the cryonics ball forward with supporting and doing present-day practical science.
It's like kind of getting back to the roots of Alcor. Like Alcor was started, I'm sorry if you say all of this and I'm jumping the gun, but like Alcor was started as very like science and research focused, and I get the sense that kind of over the years it took a turn for a little more like you said, the speculative futurism stuff, and now they're kind of returning back to those roots.
And I understand both sides, right? Like I understand something that is in the space that Alcor is in getting to be a little more speculative, transhumanist, what some people might consider weird, because they're dealing with death and life extension and something that is fundamentally a little bit weird. And so I get drifting in that direction. I don't think that's necessarily bad. They are now wanting to move in another direction and sort of like the more sciencey, more hard facts, and like let's move the ball forward on the ground with what we know now. And I also understand that direction because that's, we can sit here and talk all day about like whether nano robots are going to be able to repair my brain tissue and will I still be Chris? But what are we doing today?
Right.
With our donor money to advance this science. And as an example, when we were just saying hard science, like they have a bunch of frozen humans that they are constantly needing to monitor anyway. So why not use those bodies for study? And in fact, you sign a waiver when you're becoming an Alcor member to consent to your brain and body being studied while you're frozen. And as we mentioned last episode, supposedly contributing to medical research is one of the main reasons that some folks cite wanting to have themselves frozen in the first place, which is kind of an amazing thing. Also, cryopreservation of transplant organs, in vitro fertilization of embryos. Both of those things might be considered like practical endeavors that Alcor contributes science to. That is what we're talking about when we talk about, or think of organ transplants. If you have to picture something, picture
Right.
organ transplants is like the practical science that they want to move towards.
Right, because there are other companies that are developing technologies where it's like, oh, we can freeze a kidney and then unfreeze a kidney. And like Alcor is in that kind of bucket. And there's one, not to go back, but there is one other thing that I think also makes it a little difficult to want to hop into an interview with us or immediately be like, hello, yes, talk about my company on your show.
Something we ran into a couple times last season as well.
When you're reaching out to somebody and the name of your podcast is Cult or Just Weird, raises some hackles, obviously. And
so are you the bad thing or are you the other thing that's also bad?
the unfortunate reality that we've learned as we've been doing this research is that getting compared to cults has been damaging to companies like Alcor in the past, because unfortunately in this arena, there have been scams and there have been like literal new religious movements that pop up and position themselves as, you know, related to cryonics when they absolutely are not, that are doing true like culty shit. And so it makes sense that a company like Alcor that is focusing on like the hard science of cryopreservation.
Brand-wise, you'd want to dissociate.
Yeah, if you've been harmed by people calling you a cult in the past, I can totally understand being like, why are you contacting me if your podcast is called Cult or Just Weird?
That being said, we're not changing the title. I'm so sorry.
No, it is. We're in season 6.
It's too late. We are committed. Speaking of branding. Back to the tour, though. Now we're on the extended version of the tour. The next thing we got to see was now we're still in the science lab, a bag of the vitrification fluid, which you pull out of a freezer for us, basically. And it was like pretty wild and like very like incongruous to look at because it was super cold, but it was still in liquid form. It wasn't frozen solid.
Anything else would be ice at that point.
Right. And that's exactly the point, actually, is that by pumping a patient's body with this stuff, replacing their normal bodily fluids, which are water-based, with this vitrification fluid, they can keep the body at stasis temperatures, at the negative 320 temperatures, without them freezing solid, which is one of the main problems as to why a quote-unquote normal freezing process damages tissue beyond repair. When ice forms out of the water in your bodily fluid, it forms these crystals, and the resulting pressures from these crystals ruptures cells and tissues.
The thing that I thought was so interesting about learning about this was Mr. Arrowwood mentioned that like there's a misconception that the ice crystals that form in the freezing process like explode the cell walls, like because ice, expands obviously. And so there's this misconception that like, oh, the ice expands and then like blows out your cell walls. But actually what happens, according to what we learned on this tour, is that when the body freezes, it collapses the cell walls. And that does feel very counterintuitive, but it was just, I don't know, I thought that was cool to like learn something that I was not going to learn anywhere else.
Yeah, it's still damage, but it just damages in a way that's like a little bit counterintuitive. And the vitrification fluid is there to solve this, which is kind of why I mentioned before that like the main problem with freezing humans now seems to be a lot less about just like tissue damage, because that's not really an issue for companies like Alcor, and more about advancing neurological research to understand what would need to be preserved in a human brain to preserve the person it got frozen as. And also the unfreezing and the curing of the underlying disease or old age. But they'll get to that. By the way, cryonicists have a word to differentiate the legally declared death of a person to what they consider actually really for real super dead.
You ain't coming back from it.
Not even freezing would help them. Like, for example, if the brain was damaged too much, or if you were incinerated by jumping into a volcano.
If a steamroller went over your head.
And you just like pancake and like floated down like on a Looney Tunes.
Yeah.
They call that information theoretic death, which I think is an interesting term. And I understand that if you believe that the patients are still alive, just in stasis, then you would need a different term to like mean like for real dead.
Unretrievable.
After the lab, we got to see the operating room where they prepare bodies or lopped off heads for the doers.
This was so cool.
So they have this metal operating table that facilitates the introduction of the aforementioned vitrification fluid into the body. And this table is also where they start the freezing process, which, by the way, has to happen very slowly in order to minimize damage. The rate we were cited was roughly 1 degree Fahrenheit every 10 minutes. So if you're a balmy 98.6 and you need to get yourself to a refreshing negative 320 degrees, doing the math there means it takes about 69 hours to fully and safely freeze a human body. This is where you laugh at 69. Okay.
There's also, we forgot to mention that they have a whole contraption set up for the transport to get here that they showed us. Like, they have a whole, like, gurney set up, essentially, where the body is put in ice, and there's, like, a cool mask that you get that, like, super cools the face as well to get you nice and cold before you get to this room where they properly bring down your temperature.
The sooner they can start doing all that stuff, the better. And it's also important, by the way, to keep oxygen flowing inside the body to prevent cell metabolism from fucking up, basically. It's interesting because there's like a ton of urgency around getting the legally dead body to get started with the vitrification, as you just mentioned. But then like after that, it needs to proceed like really methodically and slowly. It's too much to go into here, but they actually have like a crack team that's like specifically trained and tasked with retrieving their legally dead patients and bringing them to Alcor, which I found fascinating that they just have like a strike team.
I've heard it referred to as DART team.
DART?
D-A-R-T. Might be a different thing, but I've seen that. They play
darts?
I've seen that term thrown around online.
Thrown around like a dart. Well, what is that? Is that like an acronym? What is that?
I don't know. I did not see it as like, here's what DART means. I've just seen people talking about Alcor's DART team.
Huh. After that, we got to go check out their workshop. So this is like,
was so cool.
Yeah. Like the whole facility was cool because literally it's like 1/3 science lab, 1/3 hospital, and 1/3 engineering shop.
Yeah.
It's like this interesting mix of stuff.
Father-son team.
Yeah. The workshop is a father-son team, and that's where they make the toys out of the 3D printed stuff that we were talking about.
They built their own 3D printer there.
That's right. And they also basically just use this workshop for them to tinker on devices. And it was explained to us that a lot of this tinkering involves figuring out how to take existing medical technology, which can be extremely bulky, and you know what I mean if you've ever had an MRI or an X-ray or something, and making it portable. So that aforementioned like strike team that goes out to retrieve the legally dead patients can take stuff with them that they need. After that, we got to see the inner sanctum, the place where the magic happens, the doer room itself.
It was so cool.
Are you trying to work on like a new catchphrase?
I'm just saying this literally was like one of the coolest things I've ever done. And I don't mean like coolest things I've ever done for the show. I mean, this is one of the coolest things I have ever done. And I know that I am at like risking sounding like I am gushing. Again, I'm not saying like the science is cool because it's great.
Gushing.
I'm gushing. I'm saying that this facility was just dope as hell. It was just really fun to visit and learn, and it was cool.
Well, you described the physical look of the doers for our audience. Can you paint a really quick picture of the room in which they were contained?
This is another profound place. Like, there was a lot of reverence in this spot. So you walk in, and the area of this room that a visitor is able to occupy is quite small compared to the rest of the room.
It's like a viewing area.
Where the doers are, it is behind glass. It is behind a very secure door because obviously this is like the most important room in the entire facility. There were, how many doers do you think were in there? Dozen?
No, more than a dozen.
20?
Yeah, at least 20.
There were probably about 20 doers behind this glass in kind of like lined up around the room. There was also a like...
It kind of did look like a brewery if you've ever done in like a brewery tour.
Yeah, it kind of looks like a brewery.
Like if instead of having like big fat vats of like wort and beer and whatever, if instead like the vats were skinny,
yeah,
it kind of looked like that.
And then a sprinkler system on top. We saw all the like, oh, there's the computer that's monitoring it. There was also, I believe, like almost as if it was on a museum display, there was a very early cryopreservation chamber that had been from, I think, like...
It's like a capsule.
I think it was the James... I could be wrong. I apologize, Alcor, if I'm getting this wrong. But I believe this was the James Bedford...
So the first guy that got
I think so. The first cryopreserved.
I'm pretty sure they told us that.
Because I believe that they took his body from that original cryopreservation chamber and have since placed it into one of their doors.
Yeah.
So there was like... It was like part museum, part medical... facility, and then also part like chapel, because again, this is like, these are where people are resting post legal death, and it was very quiet in there, and the lighting was low in the area where we were in, and it just felt like, you know, you wanted to be very respectful of these choices that people had made and of the work that's going into this. It was just, I don't have a similar experience to really anywhere as this room.
Yeah, I agree with all that, and I think Mr. Arrowwood himself also mentioned that he described that room as a reverent place, and I agree. At minimum, it's a cemetery and a monument to our collective human struggle with death and dying, and it could be much more. So I definitely felt the heaviness of meaning that was present in that room. And so, yeah, they have about, as we said, it looked like 20 doers, which means...
We could probably do the math because you said there's 227 patients.
20 times 4. Yeah, we could do the math, but we're not going to.
Yeah.
Because this is a podcast.
Remember, there's heads,
Instead, I'm going to tell you about
bodies,
some interesting VIPs that are there.
Ooh.
The stuff you really want to know.
The juicy stuff.
Alcor is correctly very concerned.
Shaquille O'Neal.
About patient confidentiality. No, he is still alive. But yeah, so Alcor didn't tell us about anyone that was actually in there, which, again, that's a good thing. But there's some information out there about people that are... so I'm going to tell you about some people that are patients, currently alive members, and also patients that are in the doer room.
These are publicly known.
These are publicly known.
Declared.
So if you guys know Ray Kurzweil, he's still alive. He's a famous futurist and natural language researcher. He wrote The Singularity is Near. He's like the high priest of singularitarianism. He's like employed at Google as their chief futurist or something. Yeah, he's one of those. I still like Ray Kurzweil.
Love Ray Kurzweil.
So he's a member.
He's got some problems, but I love him.
He's got some problems, but I love him. He is a member at Alcor. Nick Bostrom.
He's an Alcor member?
Nick Bostrom, yeah.
Damn.
Yeah. And also Peter Thiel, Silicon Valley financier and esteemed supervillain. He is also a member. And maybe the most famous, at least like to lay people who aren't into like futurism.
To people who got that Who Shot JR reference?
Yes. To our older... Actually, so the person we're talking about, it might even be older than that because he played baseball in the 40s. Oof. So Ted Williams is also frozen there. This ended up becoming public information via some like court documents back. There was actually a little bit of a controversy that like things didn't go super great with this, but like it is public knowledge now that Ted Williams is also frozen there.
All right.
So if we ever become members, we're going to wake up in the future with a bunch of friends that include Ray Kurzweil, Nick Bostrom, Peter Thiel, and Ted Williams. And probably some other celebrities who...
We just don't know.
There was a few that there's like rumor, but I couldn't quite verify, so I'm not saying them.
And there's a lot of people who also like publicly signed up and then were like, actually, I changed my mind, and I wonder. Like Timothy Leary was a huge cryonics guy, and
that makes sense.
He was signed up, and then supposedly he like changed his mind at the last second, and I'm kind of like, Did
he though?
Yeah. Larry King also changed his mind supposedly.
Oh man, I don't know if. All right.
I know it's an interesting group.
It's an interesting bunch.
But there's also a bunch of like regular degulars.
Right.
So.
Of course, just like us, we're totally regular. Nothing wrong with us. If you can't tell, we were like, I kind of want to sign up. The rest of the tour was sort of a wind down from where we were. We saw a few of the less interesting, like businessy places. Like saw a conference room. We got to see the CEO's office. And then we chatted with him for like another 30 or so minutes.
In the really nice lobby.
Before warming up. In the really nice lobby, kind of exactly where he was talking to the doctors earlier. at this point, it was mostly him talking about his work there and the new direction we talked about that they're trying to go with Alcor. And again, I think it's the right direction. I think, it's certainly it's important to think about possible speculative future science to revive people. But when it comes to like, well, how are we going to get there? I think it makes sense to focus on that more. All right, Kayla, our audience may be wondering at this point, wow, Cryonics sure sounds neat, but is it right for me? And it's pretty much out of reach financially for most people, right? This is only something that like crazy ass rich people do.
Yeah, and
right?
I feel like I asked you at one point, like, how much do you think this costs? And you said like some crazy numbers.
You did. I think I said something like my guess. And actually, I want our audience to guess right now how much it costs before we talk about it.
Sit in your mind and think how much your body frozen with like cutting edge technology
indefinitely
in perpetuity. Yeah, how much do you think that costs?
I think my number was like over $1 million, and I thought that would be like cheap.
So for Alcor, and again, we're talking about like the gold standard. We're talking about a number that encompasses both your stay at the facility as well as the transport to get there, because some other cryonics companies will charge you a number, but that doesn't include the transport. You have to arrange your own transport, and that's a separate fee. So we're talking about like
all expense paid trip to the afterlife
thing. At the time of this recording, or at least the time of the visit, for a full body, it was $200,000.
Incredibly cheap.
And for a neuro patient, it is $80,000.
Insanely cheap.
And those are big numbers. I am poor. So those are big numbers to me.
Cheap in terms of like what you're buying.
Yes.
Not necessarily accessible, except
one of the craziest things that I learned, and I'm still wrapping my head around it, is how most people pay for cryonics, how most people pay to be cryopreserved. So obviously,
Lotto.
It's a lot.
Shout out to the lottery episode.
You pay the you play the lottery. If you're Peter Thiel, if you're Ray Kurzweil, probably
If you're Peter Thiel, fuck you. If you're somebody else like Ray Kurzweil, maybe you can afford it.
You can probably pay up front. Most other people don't have $200,000 sitting around at home. And so the way that most people pay for this, the way that most people fund their stay at Alcor is through life insurance.
Which is really interesting because it feels like it's the only time life insurance is actually literally true.
Yeah.
So you're actually insuring your life. We talked about this a little bit with them when we were there because like that, this isn't like no secret. Like this is actually a thing that they put forward.
There are cryonics friendly life insurance companies now.
Yeah, so they actually have relationships with insurance companies that know how to do this, like that do this all the time with them. And one of the concerns I think that I had before we went there was like, okay, what if I take my life insurance and spend it on Alcor and then like I die when I'm, 45 and leave my wife and kids behind and they get screwed, which, fine, fuck them, right? I'm dead. Who cares? But that kind of feels mean.
Yeah.
It kind of feels unethical. But they explained that, like, for the most part, this is in addition to people's, like, quote unquote, regular life insurance, not instead of people's regular life
signing
insurance.
Up for life insurance. Alcor is the beneficiary. You overfund, quote unquote, overfund your life insurance. So, like, if you're a full body patient, maybe you'll get a $250,000 life insurance policy. So you're paying on that policy monthly. Obviously, the younger and quote unquote healthier you are, the cheaper that's going to be.
It's life insurance.
Yeah, the older and maybe more illnesses you have, the more expensive it's going to be. So the accessibility can still vary greatly, but a life insurance policy is far more accessible than I expected cryonics to be. And there's also, because again, there's so much room for like financial scamming in our world. And especially for something like this, where like you might set up a fund and then like you're dead and you don't know what the hell's going on with it. It's very important to a company like Alcor to make sure people's money is protected. And so they have like I'm not good at numbers and maths and monies, so I still don't fully understand this, but the fund, like the money that comes from patients is a separate entity from like Alcor, the company, a patient trust. So there's at least some protections in place so that people aren't just like
it's good procedure
getting their monies taken away and then having their bodies thought out. But the life
speaking of
insurance thing,
yeah.
there's a whole, like, if you go online, you will see people talking about like how to do this. Like there are, I mean, Alcor has a to-do list of like, here's how to do this, because it's a very in-depth, detailed, detail-oriented process. So like, I don't know. I was just so surprised by this wrinkle as well. I thought it was very interesting.
And there's another reason, actually, why it's cheaper than you might expect. And that's that only about 40% of the costs of caring for a patient are covered by the payment that the patient themselves make through this, either through upfront if you're mega wealthy, or through this patient trust insurance thing. It only covers about 40% of the costs. The other 60% is funded by donations. So like not the individual. Alcor has like a pool of donor money that they use to cover the rest of the costs involved for keeping patients in stasis.
Right. One more thing I will say is one of the first things I did.
You need to stop saying one more thing because it's like on your 75th thing.
Another thing I will say about the money aspect of this is one of the first things I did when we decided to do this topic, and when it had been presented, especially this part had been presented as kind of like a scam on how to with John Wilson, is I wanted to go look at the financials of the company. Mm-hmm. And again, I'm not the IRS. I know that people have money in the Caymans. I don't know what the fuck. But if you do go look at the financials, which are publicly available, you can go look at, you know, companies' tax returns or whatever. It checks out. Like, this is not the kind of company where the CEO is making like $500 million and like the employees are making $2 million and like no money's actually going into the research. The financials actually do what they say that they're doing.
Yeah. And in terms of the patients, in terms of the cost to the patient, I think accessibility also makes a huge difference in how I view it, because it would seem like if it was something that you could only, if it was $2 million and they didn't have this like insurance thing and they didn't have the donor money and blah, 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 then it would definitely seem like, okay, this is a thing for like freaky rich people, weirdos.
Right.
They go to their Bohemian Grove meeting in the afternoon, and then at night they're like spending money on their Alcor, brain freezing or whatever. The fact that it's more accessible makes it feel more normal.
This is a practice that's like by cryonicists for other cryonicists, and like it does seem legitimately like it's a community that wants to make sure that this is a thing for their community and not just the Peter Thiels of the world. Right.
And the fact that it's funded so much by donations kind of also ties back to wanting to protect the branding and not be associated with like cult-like behavior.
Right. Because
like that makes a material difference to these people that like are in their care.
Right.
Right. Like if their funding dries up, then like what do? We talked about business risk being one of the risks to the long-term preservation of these people. So like that's part of why they're so protective of their brand. And yeah, I guess actually it is just rich people paying for it after all, since it's 60% of it is donations.
Well, you don't have to be rich to make a donation.
Other people. Yeah, I know. But like a lot of it is like rich donors.
Sure, yeah.
I'm sure.
It's not like me chucking $5 in the GoFundMe.
Rich people. Yeah, well, as we know, GoFundMe is the primary way that we pay for medical expenses in America. Speaking of the people involved, were we speaking of that? I said rich people. Rich people are people too. Speaking of the people involved in cryonics, I think it's probably a good idea to like actually talk to one of them.
What?
Can we do that?
Oh.
Can we get a producer to sit in the corner so I can ask them things like, can we do that, Steve? Can we get that clip? I want one of those.
Do those guys actually exist? Like, I've seen Joe Rogan talking to like, Steve, pull that clip up or whatever.
Yeah.
But I've never seen.
You've never seen Steve?
No. Is he real?
It's like the guy. Wasn't there like a producer on like Regis? Oh my God. You know what?
Don't make a Regis.
I was going to make a Regis and Kathy Lee morning show.
No.
Oh God.
No.
Oh my God. I'm making just the worst, oldest references today.
This is bad. But to answer your question, as a producer, oh yeah, you better believe we can talk to someone.
Oh, all right. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Steve from Off Camera.
Steve from Off Camera lined up an interview, and we will get to that in our next episode.
Next time on Cult or Just Weird.
This is Kayla.
And this is Chris. Thank you for going on this journey with us.